Good morning and welcome to the webinar on our sustainability webinar series on Pulse Canada. My name is Dean Dick. I'm the farm management specialist at the Ag Info Center, and I'm going to be sitting in the background and kind of watching how things work with the webinar. Before we start, and I pass it over to Carrie Ann, just a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a link tomorrow to view the webinar just in case you want to, you've missed anything. Secondly, if you want to ask a question of our presenter, there is the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So please type in your questions and they will be handled at the end of the presentation. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Carrie Ann for introductions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Ann Kohler-Monroe, and I'm work at Alberta Agriculture Forestry in the Environmental Stewardship Branch. We host this sustainability webinar series, which is a series that aims to increase awareness and support of sustainability platforms in the agriculture industry. So we're really lucky to have our presenter this morning, Denis Tremorin from Pulse Canada. Denis is a director of sustainability at Pulse Canada and is a professional agrologist with 12 years of experience. Denis received his bachelor's and master's degree in agroecology and soil science from the University of Manitoba. Denis works within a team of Pulse Canada, which focuses on gaining recognition of pulses as healthy, nutritious, and sustainable foods. Denis's work explores the role that pulses can have in improving the environmental sustainability of the food system, in particular, the role that pulses can have in improving foods through reformulation. Denis has also worked on environmental metrics that apply to Canadian cropping systems and is exploring how these metrics and the use of local and farm-based data can help to assess the sustainability of our food systems. So a wealth of information as a presenter. So we're looking forward to your presentation, Denis. And again, if you do have questions, we will be posing them to Denis after the presentation. And hopefully you can stay the whole time. All right, I will pass it on to you, Denis. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Carrie Ann. Oh, there we go. That's probably easier to hear me. I've known Carrie Ann for a long time. I think since I started this job, my previous boss, Gord Kurbis, he had introduced me to you and Tom, and so we've had a good relationship, but also had a good time. I've had a good time and watching what you guys do in Alberta, especially at the governmental level, which is different than most ministries across Canada. We see lots of leadership and kind of innovation happening out of the province of Alberta, especially within government, amongst other places. So yeah, my background, there was a good background there. I've been working with Pulse Canada for about 9.5 years. And previous to that, I worked for a hog company, which is now called High Life. They're more of a pork company now, and I was doing environmental operations with that company, focused really on manure management within all of their operations, mostly in Manitoba. So I've always worked from an academic standpoint and also from a professional standpoint in environmental affairs and agriculture. But now this is a bit more technical, what I focus on now, and playing with numbers rather than playing with actual dirty things. There you go. So anyways, today my talk is going to be focusing on our advantage in sustainability that we have within Canadian Pulses. And when I say sustainability, I'm really focused on the environmental side. And I think a lot of this information actually translates into other crops and even livestock products in Canada. And how can we translate that into an advantage for our Canadian products, in the sense that a lot of what we've done so far in Canada gives us a leg up when we look at environmental footprints of foods. So just a bit of background on what Pulse Canada is. We're an industry association of associations. So we represent the Canadian pulse industry, so primary pea, lentil, bean, chickpea, and now faba bean production. And we don't represent growers directly. We represent them through 4 provincial associations in Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And we also represent the trade through an association of exporters, brokers, and processors called the Canadian Special Crops Association. They contribute funds to Pulse Canada. Basically, the system works that they invested Pulse Canada based on the value they see in our organization. So their own boards have to decide that. We have our own board, which comprises members of all those 5 organizations. And then we take those funds and we typically leverage them for funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, including the work I'm going to speak to today. We have I'm going to talk about this one first here. Pulse Canada works in 2 main areas. One is the area of increasing efficiency, and in this area we focus primarily in the areas of transportation and market access. Transportation is a big deal for us as the agriculture sector has a long distance to market and to port. We rely heavily on rail, but also our sector with special crops tends to get weaker service than other associations, than other crops. So we focus a lot on rail service. And then market access is obviously a big deal with a country like ours exporting the vast majority of pulses that we produce. That's a high priority for our industry. And then the other area of activity is adding value. We've always focused on the attributes that we can sell for pulses in the terms of nutrition, health, and sustainability. And by sustainability, we really focus a lot on environmental sustainability. And then the other piece here that's missing is functionality, and how can we use these pulses within different food applications, and how, if we put pea flour or lentil flour into a bread product, what are the attributes of that product, of that ingredient, like lentil flour, which perform good or not, and what do we have to do to change that application? So that's just a little bit of high value, the high end Pulse Canada activities. In 2017 and 2016, we worked a lot on a strategy for the next 5 years of work for Pulse Canada. And we devised this strategy where we want to really focus on diversifying our market base. And this is where this 25 by 25 strategy came from, which really focuses on the idea that we need to diversify 25% of our production base into new and diversified markets, and we call them non-traditional markets, because most of our products are sold and exported and are consumed in a traditional manner. So either they're being used as feed crops locally, or they're being used as in traditional formats in South Asia. So dal, curries, and here domestically often used as chilies and canned products, and things like that. And we want to see if we can diversify that, utilizing pulses in applications that aren't as conventional. So trying to increase use in pet food as an example, or increasing the use of ingredients into consumer packaged goods. So proteins, starches, and flours is something that we're really focusing on. So I just want to talk a little bit at a high level about what do we know already within Canada, and what type of data has been developed already within Canada to help to market Canadian pulses, but also other crops. One thing we know is that we have a footprint environmentally that's improving. This is some work that I helped to lead within the Canadian Fieldprint initiative, where we looked at how can we leverage Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada data to take a look at what's the actual footprint of our crops over time in some key indicator areas. So as we can see, this is a spidergram where if it gets smaller, things are improving. And if we look at all crops across Canada, typically what you're seeing is a shrinking of that footprint over time within these indicators. There are some indicators specifically on land use and biodiversity where if we looked at this, it doesn't show the same. It doesn't show the same shrinking of impact. We're actually expanding our impact a little bit. But this is the good news story that we can tell, especially within some of the areas that are really hot topics right now, such as climate impact and even land use efficiency. The land that we are using, we're using it more efficiently. We also have some good studies that have been conducted. The Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops has been working for a number of years now, and one of the big outcomes that we appreciate here is the development of these carbon footprint reports, which we're really able to leverage to take a look at, even at a regional level, what is the carbon footprint of peas or lentils or other crops across Canada. It was done regionally with these regional units, which I have a map for, but I'm not in my presentation deck. But basically, from the pulse sector side, if we account for carbon sequestration in our soils, we almost have a carbon neutral product here that we're producing. From the pea standpoint. For lentils, it's actually carbon negative with sequestration. So I hope I'm not getting over people's heads here, but really we've got a pretty good story to tell. And this is the case especially for a lot of Western Canadian crops, is very, very low carbon footprints for crops. And it's something that we can sell. This is just detailing that information a bit more. Again, if we look at that information from the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, we really see that there's a number of items that we can highlight as being important for carbon footprint. Nitrous oxide emissions, N2O, which is the fifth column about. That's a really important factor to capture. Also, the amount of energy to manufacture fertilizer is still substantial, and then energy use is substantial. So if we think about this crop in particular, even though dried peas are being inoculated and are being fertilized, only being fertilized with perhaps phosphorus and potash, emissions from this nitrous oxide piece are still significant, and that's due to a little bit of fertilizer, but also crop residues. I don't have time to explain all of this, I think, but you can ask me questions afterwards. Carrie Ann knows a lot about this too. So the other big factor that we've been able to account for in Canada, and we're lucky to have the methodologies to do this, is changes in soil carbon. So across Canada, there's different potential to increase soil carbon in our soils, and we have different practices that are encouraging that as well. So for example, in some parts of Manitoba, we don't have as much no-till as in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So therefore, our carbon sequestration numbers are a little bit lower. So anyways, these are basically, I'm just laying out what's important when we're talking about carbon here. Basically, it's fertilizer and practices that would help sequester carbon. And the other thing that we do know also is that agronomic practices matter. This is some work that we had conducted with the Saskatchewan Research Council, looking at a meta-analysis of cropping systems in Canada. We were trying to leverage all the research that was done already on monocultures versus pulse and cereal rotations. And we were able to determine that, okay, yes, based on all the research that we have, we see increases in yield when we rotate peas with cereals versus a monoculture cereal rotation. And we also have the potential to decrease fertilizer use. And so this slide basically is showing that the carbon footprint of wheat in a monoculture rotation is 330 kilograms of CO2 per ton. If we look at wheat coming off of a P rotation, it goes down about 13% if we account for a yield increase. And that's if, so the blue bar is basically wheat that's grown after peas, but a farmer decides not to change anything in terms of his fertilizer practices compared to a monoculture rotation. And then the far right one is a scenario where what if the farmer decided to reduce the amount of fertilizer they use to maintain yield as in the same sense that you would see from a monoculture rotation. And in that case, that wheat has a very low carbon footprint. The optimum is probably somewhere between the blue and the green, and we don't know what that is just yet. So I'm going to keep it flowing here. There's animation apparently, and I'll just move on. One other thing that we focused on a lot over the past, the 10 years that I've been here, was the development of metrics and on-farm tools to enable our industry to tell a story about sustainability, but also to meet market demands for information that are coming. So Pulse Canada was the manager of a project under Growing Forward 2, which really was the impetus for this initiative which was called the Canadian Fieldprint Initiative. And the idea behind that was really we were following some work that had started in the US by Field to Market, where they developed metrics and tools to do the same things. And what we were able to build was an on-farm calculator, which leverages information we already have on soils and climates across Canada, and the farmer just has to put in his farm practices, and then he gets a report with land use efficiency, soil erosion risk, energy use, and other indicators that are going to get developed as we speak. And then this was developed first as an Excel-based application, but then we had developed actually an application process interface, so an API, so that companies could actually utilize their own software to be able to produce these reports. That's a highly technical thing that's way over my head, but I'll leave it at that. So these are the kind of reports that a farmer would see. They get a report showing how they perform, how their field or farm performed in terms of these indicators, and it even provides an opportunity to compare that farm to other farms that would be in the area if there was a pilot project with several producers together. So this work has actually been leveraged by General Mills, and they're using this tool for their oat supply chain in Canada, which is what they use for Cheerios and other cereal products. And really the outcome that a company like General Mills is looking for is something like this. This is some work that they've done in Idaho with a local wheat supply chain in an irrigated district in southern Idaho. This is actually a very tight supply chain that they use for Wheaties. And really the idea here is they're trying to use this information to help the growers to make improvements compared to the and they're trying to compare them to their district or their state to see, are these guys getting better than these other groups. If you compare this to the state, it's not it doesn't look as good. That's because this is an irrigated district versus most of the wheat in Idaho is going to be dry land. So it's a bit of apples and oranges, but if you look on the top half of this table, the comparing to district is actually the numbers that are most relevant from this case. And what they were able to find out within this production system is that a lot of the farmers, the low-hanging fruit was irrigation efficiency, and that's why you see these big numbers on irrigation. They were able to really hone in on that and make improvements. So anyways, a similar story can be told around this pilot project in Canada around oats. I just don't have the slides to tell it. So um, the other thing I want to talk about, just to finish this piece about Canadian Fieldprint Initiative, is that just to get some information out to this group here, is in November, there's going to be an announcement at this Field to Market annual meeting in Indianapolis. Over the last few years, we've, as a group, been talking internally with other collaborators in this project, with other associations, about what's the next step for this initiative. We've had questions about whether we should create our own NGO to support this type of work in the future, and what's our affiliation going to be with the Field to Market group in the U.S. So just so everybody knows, I can't say anything right now because it's the message is under lock and key. But there's going to be an announcement at this meeting from November 20th and 21st about what the Fieldprint Initiative is going to become, and what Field to Market is going to, the affiliation with Field to Market is going to be. And I guess what's driving this is really the idea that our initiative was really a project at the end of the day, which was co-funded by the federal government. And there's a number of members of Field to Market, such as food companies and retailers and ingredient companies and agri-food businesses that wanted to conduct this work in Canada. But there's no legal entity to associate with in Canada, and the continuity of the project is in danger if it's just a project based on federal funding. So we had all of that brings us to today's date, and we'll have some news coming out in the next month here. So I just want to make sure I'm checking my time here. One thing that we are interested in doing with this type of tool, though, is exploring how do we leverage that farm level data to conduct food level life cycle assessments. And this is something that we haven't started yet. It's a concept that we're mulling, and we're trying to figure out who Pulse Canada would work with. It's something that we at Pulse Canada have a specific interest in based on our past work. We see this as kind of the natural evolution of what we've worked on in the past. But it's just, we're still at the conception phase here. The idea being we're starting to build a capacity in Canada to access data on farm. There's lots of discussions around digital backbones and machine learning and artificial intelligence in agriculture these days. It's basically smart ag. And how can we start to develop linkages with that type of data to end users that want that level of detail? So I'll leave this at that. It's just another little project that apparently I have to bring to fruition somehow. Anyways, I'm going to talk now about some work that is coming up and that we're currently focused on. We were awarded at Pulse Canada some funding under the Agrasurance Program of the Canadian Agricultural Partnership back in April, I believe. This project has this following title of highlighting the quality attributes of our pulse industry in Canada. We were awarded $1.6 million from Ag Canada for a total budget of 2.1. And the great thing about this program is that it's 75% funded by AFC rather than 50-50 split. So it's funded for 4 years, and we're starting in this fiscal year, which ends in March. And really, there's two areas of work that we're focused on which relate to environmental sustainability. There's other projects in this application that are more related to nutritional and functional quality of pulses, but I'll focus on the sustainability environmental side. So the first piece is we have an understanding in Canada that one of the issues we have in the pulse sector, especially globally, not just in Canada, is that there's a lack of good data available for people conducting assessments of food and agricultural products. And one thing we can do in Canada is at least ensure that the Canadian pulse sector is well represented when it comes to data that would feed the type of assessments that we know companies, academics, and governments are utilizing to assess the impacts of agricultural production. So we are going to be starting some work on developing new inventories of data and conducting LCAs of our pulse products in Canada. And I'll speak to that now, really with the end goal of trying to ensure that these major inventories that I mentioned on the right-hand side, such as EcoInvent, the World Food LCA database, and AgriFootprint, have this data ready and available for LCA practitioners around the world, is the idea. One thing that I wanted to highlight is that recently in Canada, we've had a pretty good development of expertise in the agri-food sector with lifecycle analysis. And I just wanted to highlight a few groups. The other group that is not mentioned here is actually Saskatchewan Research Council, which we've worked with in the past. But Grady Diaz at the University of Waterloo has conducted a lot of work on dietary LCAs within the agri-food space. So looking at the impact of different diets in Canada and especially in Ontario. Nathan Pelletier is a consultant who was a consultant in the past and also was affiliated with Dalhousie University, but he's actually started his own lab at the University of British Columbia, I believe in Kelowna, and he has a large focus on LCA and even databases in Canada for agri-food. And then Groupe Ageco is a consultancy in Quebec, and they have an affiliation with this International Reference Center for Lifecycle of Products, Processes, and Services, which is based in Quebec as well. They're inter-university group, actually, with a lot of experience in LCA and a lot of expertise. One of the world leaders, actually, in that area. So we're lucky in Canada to have this expertise that we can start to leverage, and these people have the connections to be able to access information from our agricultural systems as well. So just to speak on a project that we're getting going right now, we are focusing right first on Canadian peas and lentils, and we want to conduct inventory of Canadian pea and lentil production for these databases that we spoke about just prior to this slide. And then our second step to this project is we're going to be conducting ISO compliant life cycle analysis for Canadian pea and lentil production. Again, with the goals of developing inventory data, and we want to make sure we also have conducted the actual analysis of the products to allow us within Pulse Canada and within our partners to be able to market the environmental footprint of these crops with the strongest data that we can access. And so we had an RFP that was out, I guess, a month or two ago. We had sent that out to a number of organizations that I actually mentioned before, and we actually have awarded the contract for this work to this Nathan Pelletier from the University of British Columbia, who is also the lead of this new Canadian Agri-Food Lifecycle Data Center, which will be its own small data hub for Canada, which is another project that he's leading. So we actually have a project committee, which consists of members of our three producer associations, the Manitoba Pulse, Saskatchewan Pulse, and Alberta Pulse growers. We have staff from those three organizations that are going to help with the process of developing these inventories and LCAs. And we also have Carrie Ann with Alberta Agriculture and Food is going to help with this process as well. And I'll speak to why, which is Alberta is actually, the government of Alberta with their partners on the association side have actually developed an LCA for Alberta peas already. So they have the experience and knowledge that will help really drive this project moving forward. And then it's not going to end here. A natural next step to conducting a Canadian pea LCA is to actually start to look at ingredients that come from peas, specifically protein and starches from these new fractionation plants and that are coming, that are being built in Canada, but also we're hoping to attract more, obviously. But other ingredients like pulse flours are going to be of interest as well. But we also have to it'd be good to fill in the gaps on beans in Canada, as well as faba beans, because it's a new and emerging crop, and it has a really strong environmental footprint if you look at the amount of protein in a faba bean versus our other pulse crops. Anyways, I'm going to keep on moving. Just wanted to highlight this Alberta P life cycle analysis that Nevin Rosassen was heavily involved in this at Alberta Pulse Growers, but also Carrie Ann was heavily involved in this as well with the Alberta government. And so it's great to have this piece where we already have an idea of what are the impacts of a segment of our production system with peas, and how does this all boil out. They were actually able to compare that with other studies, and it looks like it's in line with what we see has been done already with some research studies on carbon footprints in Canada. And it also shows that we also have a stronger footprint than some other places across the world. So that's a good thing to see so far. And the next thing that they did also was they didn't just stop at conducting a life cycle analysis of Alberta peas. They actually moved it a step further and developed an environmental product declaration from this life cycle analysis. And my understanding of environmental product declaration is it's kind of like a standardized way of reporting on the outcomes of a life cycle analysis. So this way things can be compared apples to apples, rather than different reporting structures can really show different things. So EPDs are being used heavily in the construction sector, but also in Europe, there's a few companies in a few regions that are using EPDs quite a bit as well. And it's just it's another opportunity to help tell a story in a way that's adds a bit more credibility and helps us to market the information. So in a transparent way. So that's that. I think, Carrie Ann could probably speak a little bit more about EPDs than I can. But this actually, I just wanted to state here, we within this Canadian pea and LCA, Canadian pea and lentil life cycle analysis work, we are exploring the opportunity to do this as well. I think this is a natural next step for us to work on. And I imagine this is what we're going to be doing at the end of the day. But we're just getting this work started, so I'll leave it at that. The other big focus for this CAP application project was exploring how reformulation with pulse ingredients can have impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, and water use indicators amongst the other LCA indicators, which are much more broad. We really want to go deep on GHG, biodiversity, and water use, because these three indicators are really being highlighted by the food industry as being really important within their supply chains. They see agriculture as having very large impacts in these areas, and it's something that they need to start to understand better. We also have new. We also have a capacity to dig a little deeper within these indicators, and I'll speak to that in a little bit here. So I think I'm doing okay with time. So really the idea is we want to get some comprehensive data on how pulses can impact reformulated food products. And we are basically, how do we do that? Well, we conduct LCAs on food products, and we do basically a scenario analysis looking at a regular product versus a reformulated product. And again, we want to use some advanced indicators for water, biodiversity, and even greenhouse gas emissions when we can. Meaning we want to basically leverage as much data as we can locally, but also use some neat new indicators, which I'll speak to in a second. So we've already started some of this work in the past. We worked with the Saskatchewan Research Council and institution in Switzerland called ETH Zurich to do a study of wheat-based products and how they were reformulated. First, we conducted this meta-analysis piece looking at how wheat is impacted by rotations with pulses. I'm going to skip past this one actually because it gets a little bit convoluted. Really, the idea here is we had 3 wheat-based products. We had pan bread, we had breakfast cereal, and we had pasta. And we reformulated it with these formulations. These formulations were provided to us by the Canadian International Grains Institute. We focused on pea flour for this work, and we were able to do both a nutritional analysis on how reformulation impacts these products, but also an environmental analysis for greenhouse gas emissions. But we focus on greenhouse gas emissions only. I'm only going to show this data here. There's a lot of other data on nutrition, and we even combined nutrition and greenhouse gas emissions. What we found was the cultivation stage was important, obviously, within these products, especially for something like pasta, where the milling and manufacturing stages are minimal, have minimal impacts. But the one product which was a little bit different was breakfast cereal, where manufacturing is actually a really important piece of this component. So even though we reformulated this product with a lot of pulse flours, the impacts weren't as important. When we look at the right-hand column, is where we see the total difference of greenhouse gas emissions. Anyways, that's that. I have a better slide than this one, but for some reason this is the one I used. So really what we're finding is that, well, the potential to reformulate pasta with only 30% greenhouse gas emissions gets you a 13% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. And I think if I'm a company and I have strategies around carbon and climate impacts, here's one strategy where we're trying to promote to companies is reformulating with pulses. If you had let's say if you had a company goal of 25% reduction, this gets you almost halfway there. So that's pretty good on the pasta product. The potential on the pan bread product is not as good compared to the others, just because it's hard to put in a lot of pea flour or lentil flour into a pan bread and still make it tasty and perform like a regular pan bread. Anyways, so just wanted to expand on this a little bit. We really have kind of 2 goals. One is to expand this analysis away just from greenhouse gas emissions. We want to focus on water and land / biodiversity. And then we also want to expand this to other products. So we were looking at, with that 25 by 25 strategy that we talked about, we have identified product categories where we think will make the biggest impact for Canadian pulses. We basically have a strategy for peas and lentils and beans and chickpeas. So these are the product applications that we think that are going to have the biggest impact for our industry if we're successful in getting incorporation rates into them. So these are the projects that we wanted to conduct these reformulated LCAs for. So things like we've already started the cereal-based work. We're expanding that to include water and biodiversity now. We actually just started another product, which is a meat-based application looking at a burger patty reformulated with whole cooked lentils, or we could use whole cooked beans if you wanted to. And this is something that our partner, Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, has been promoting as a food service opportunity. It not only provides a product that has a better nutritional and environmental profile, it has a better cost as well. So that's something that we're working on. As we get deeper into this LCA piece around ingredients, we're going to have an opportunity to take a look at other applications as well, such as dairy-based applications, where pea protein can be used to replace whey protein in yogurts. And we also see a lot of liquid milk replacements that are coming out, and pea protein is being looked at as another ingredient for that type of application. So the other thing we're going to work on quickly actually next year is going to be pet food. We see lots of pulses being used in pet food these days. It's a good question to answer is what's the environmental impact of utilizing them in those foods. We think that there's an opportunity to highlight that to the companies like Nestle Purina and others that would maybe see pulses in a even better light for those applications. All right, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up quick. I spoke a little bit earlier about this opportunity of taking a look at these new, going beyond greenhouse gas emissions. And I just had some really preliminary data I wanted to share with the group here. We're conducting this work with the burger patties with whole cooked lentils. This is the actual formulation we're using, or recipe. So we're using basically 26% cooked lentils. If we don't count the water, it's a little higher. And then we've already done some analysis on, okay, well, if we formulate with this product, and we use Canadian data for beef production and Canadian data for lentil production, which we have pretty readily available, what's the impact that we're seeing? So we do see an impact on decreasing water use and land use through this. And when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, we have really strong data, and we can actually pinpoint the type of greenhouse gas emissions we're seeing from different regions. And our question is, can we do the same thing with land use and blue water, or blue water meaning irrigated water within the food systems that we're looking at here? And the answer was yes, we can. There's been, I'm going to highlight water, but the same is the case for land use. In the case of water, we look at something called water scarcity. So is utilizing water across Canada always mean the same thing? And the answer is no. These are two census divisions in Saskatchewan, Census Division 7 and Census Division 11. And if you produce this burger patty from beef from Division 7, the little bit of irrigated water that you use within that system of feed and everything else that is encompassed has a much bigger impact. And this is also water used for beef production, obviously, has a much bigger impact in this other area where water is much more readily available and there is less stress on their water systems. So this is important complexity to kind of bring into the equation, because water use is not water use is not water use, and beef production is a good example of something that's getting hit by these type of impacts, which are apparently large, but when we peel back the onion, it may not be the same story. And the same type of data is actually available with biodiversity now, and it's good because we want to add that complexity to these analyses. It shouldn't be as simple as saying beef production produces a lot, it requires a lot of land. It's always about, well, what is the impacts of that land use? And that's the type of data we're hoping to be able to leverage within this. But again, this is just really preliminary data. I wouldn't hang my hat on it just yet, but it's something I wanted to talk about during the presentation today. So actually, that was it. That was my last slide. I hope last couple set of slides really piqued the interest of questions from the group. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to me today. And I think I've ended in a good time to be able to answer some questions here.
Yeah, great. Oh, thanks, Dennis. Yeah, definitely. You painted the Canadian Pulse crop as having a good news story, right? Especially with carbon footprint and nitrous oxide and energy use. I think I want to remind people that they can type their questions into the questions box, and we can go from there because we do have 15 minutes for questions. I guess maybe I might start with one. you mentioned the Canadian Fieldprint initiative. I guess I wanted to ask, what would be the difference between the LCA project that you mentioned and the Canadian Fieldprint initiative that you worked heavily on already?
Oh, I'm gonna go back in my slides here. Are you talking about this? Let me see here. Is it this thing that you're talking about or no?
The chain,
No.
well, it could be, but mostly the work that's already been done in the Canadian Fieldprint initiative,
Okay. Yeah.
and then the additional work, the life cycle work that you're going to be doing.
That's a good question. Actually, I think the idea behind these tools has been to be able to leverage the data, which could be easily collected from producers, and is most relevant for telling a story around the environmental footprint of crops at that farm level. Life cycle analysis has been standardized within ISO, and requires typically a broader set of data, which would be hard to get within a tool format presented to a grower or even an agronomist. So we're actually kind of exploring, well, can you supplement, although you require all of this extra data on things like, well, you know better than I do when it comes to LCA. You need all this data on things like what kind of machinery do you have, and what's the type of storage systems you have, and what's the pesticide use. There's a lot more information which is tough to grab. But we're wondering also within this concept of this project I have on the screen right now is, well, can you actually leverage the data which is most important for some of these impacts, things like yield, things like fertilizer use, things like fuel use, and basically supplement LCA with really specific data around supply chains. Anyways, it's a concept phase at this stage, but I think that's the difference from, at a high level, the difference is, yeah, we have these tools that you can use to tell a story, but they're not LCAs themselves. LCAs requires a much broader set of data, which you can capture via survey or other ways. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the granularity of the data. So you need the on-farm where the biggest impact is occurring, right?
Yeah.
And then you supplement the general data from upstream. No, that's good. Thank you very much. We do have a couple more questions, or we have a couple questions coming in now.
Okay.
What causes the variability in energy usage for growing pulses in the prairie provinces? For example, Alberta shows a much lower energy use than Manitoba.
That energy use in that context was mostly related to fuel use in equipment. So if you're looking at Alberta versus Manitoba, you're looking primarily at it would probably mostly be related to tillage systems, which is going to be lower in Alberta than in Manitoba. Manitoba also has a lot of an hydrosubonia application, which is another pass that we see. Typically, there's more pesticide applications as well in Manitoba than in Alberta. So all of that amounts to some higher energy use and fuel use at the farm level in Manitoba versus Alberta. So it's the same case in Saskatchewan, where you have regions that have very high adoptions of no-till versus regions that don't. You see higher energy use for if you're looking at one specific crop. So.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned Pulse Canada having multiple strategies by 2025. What kind of strategies do you have for beans, specifically diversifying market base? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good question. We beans is a bit different for us. For peas and lentils, it's really an export strategy because we grow so much that the impacts have to come from diversifying our export base. And for beans, we thought because our production is a lot lower, um, one strategy that may be successful for beans, because beans is a very global commodity. It's a tough one to have an impact from just Canada. One thing that we're focusing on is actually working with our provincial partners to try to increase the amount of bean consumption in Canada and link that with product of Canada beans. So we have Ontario and Alberta that are actually doing quite a bit of work on promoting bean consumption locally, and we think that actually could be substantial in terms of reaching our goals on the bean side. Is just trying to get Canadians to eat more beans. So there you go.
All right.
Yeah.
Is your strategy on your website specifically, or?
Probably the bean strategy isn't. We don't.
Okay.
I can expand a little bit more. We're looking at things like food service is a perfect opportunity, or even things like the retail kind of deli sector is a good area where we can expand bean consumption or bean use. So promoting the type of work that we see in culinary platforms. So if institutions like universities, for example, start using beans in their salads and other things like that, these are the type of things that we're looking at. So it's more food service. It's less process based in terms of turning things into flours. It's more about utilization in restaurants, culinary institutions like universities, and promoting the kind of the health and environmental benefits of consuming these foods within that kind of dietary context. So
Okay.
there you go.
That's good. Obviously, we'll have your contact information up too. So if somebody wants to expand or send you a note, I'm sure you'd be open to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
That's why
Thanks.
I brought it there at the end. So.
Okay. Regarding the information on reformulating products to incorporate pulses in is promising. Regarding the pasta, what is the feedback on the discerning pasta consumer, a high-end restaurant user, on taste, product performance, and then Barilla already has a product that you had shown in your PowerPoint.
I mean, this is something that I'm not really expert on that one. It's
Okay.
we had some, but I mean, we've seen products that came out and have done really well. The one, pasta was actually one that's a bit easier to work with. We know that it's a real challenge when it comes to food service. When you have something pasta that's even like the gluten-free pastas are a good example. They are not good when they're sitting in a pan for a while. They're okay when they're fresh, but they're not good when they've been sitting around for a bit. So there are some challenges. We don't know. I haven't heard about the reformulated products. The one thing we do know is they're selling. They're staying in the marketplace. We're seeing new ones all the time. And there's been some products that have been really well received. So Warburton's is the best example that I can think of. Warburton's is the bread company in the UK. They buy a pile of Canadian wheat, and they came out with these protein bread line a few years ago using Canadian pulses, and it was a mix of beans and lentils, I believe, and perhaps chickpea flour, and it sold like hotcakes. It's the first time they've had an increase in bread sales for a specific line of bread that they've sold in years. So it went really well. We've tried the product; it's excellent. They worked with the Canadian International Grain Institute to really make sure they refined something that would work, and it did. So if it's consumers will accept it if it tastes good. That's as simple as that. And taste can be relevant sometimes, but in this application, it really worked well. So.
Okay, thanks for that. So you'd mentioned in one of your slides of changes in soil carbon, and for using pulses in rotation. Do you actually have like a baseline year, or is it an average of baseline years to get that change that you spoke about?
That's I can't. I mean, I can't speak too well to that. I think that information that I presented is actually annual. It's based on, I believe, annual sequestration numbers from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So as long as these no-till systems are predicted to be sequestering carbon, you can only leverage the annual rate of sequestration, not a cumulative rate. If it was cumulative, wow, those products would look amazing. They would be carbon neutral, like a hole in the ground. So I think, yeah, that's basically the story. There is, we're lucky in Canada, to have the systems in place that we can, that are sequestering carbon, but not just that. We actually have the methodologies that are pretty robust to actually use in an international setting, and for this format. A lot of countries can't say that. They may, a few farmers may have adopted these practices, but they don't even have the methodologies to be able to estimate, well, is it sequestering carbon or not? We're lucky here that we do. So.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
From years and years of soil testing and modeling, for sure.
Exactly.
I'm going to throw this question out. I'm not sure if it goes with the one I just asked, but how do you establish the relationship between 1 kilogram of product yield and greenhouse gases? It's,
Is that the question?
yeah.
Okay, that you're continuing there. I mean, how did?
It's the impact. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's like I mean, this is an intensity-based measure in my mind, where you have total greenhouse gas emissions per hectare, and then we translate that by dividing it by yield. And there's all kinds of opportunities to divide all kinds of things. So you can use that just by looking at the protein yield of a crop, and looking at impacts per unit of protein. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's really the idea here is, how much impact are we having per unit of product, is an important factor to measure.
Yeah, and I think that's you somewhat spoke to that, where earlier we're talking about a life cycle assessment. Well, it all depends what data went into creating that number, and that's sort of where the environmental product declaration certification comes in, where you're making sure that you're comparing apples to apples versus apples to oranges. So again, it depends what or how you develop that relationship, but as long as you're clear what went into creating that value, that number, that you attributed the impact for the greenhouse gases, is how I see it as well.
Yeah, Carrie Ann, I think like one of the things that we're trying to do here is, we know that within LCA, although it is a ISO standardized process, there is still a pile of flexibility there. And there's a real danger and there's a real challenge of garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data. And what we're trying to do is really make sure that from a Canadian perspective, A, we have the data, and B, we put it in a format, and in a place, or in places where people are going to get access to good data, or the best data that we can provide. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think that concept is needs to be put out everywhere. Is like we need to get this information out. We've got a lot of good data. We do it in our office all the time. We create information. We're not good at disseminating it. And here we're just trying to identify, okay, well, people are using LCAs and people are using these databases. So here's one opportunity to get the information out in a way that people can access it. There's obviously other marketing things that we can do, and speaking at events and talking to everybody that we need to talk to. But this is almost a way to get it out there in a way that we're trying to leverage the system that's in place. So.
Actually, I will ask another question that goes nicely with this. So you talked about 13% CO2e reduction when a rotation of peas after cereal is used, and then a potential of even a fertilizer reduction of a 64% reduction in CO2e. Has that research been applied on a field scale with growers?
That's the meta-analysis you're talking about, right? We didn't. That work wasn't. It was actually, we actually conducted a meta-analysis of existing research.
Okay.
So meta-analysis, if you're not familiar, is a way. It's like a statistical method of taking data from many different studies, like a number of different studies that are all have the similar types of approaches and data, and then you can synthesize that data and take a look at, okay, is the outcome all in the same direction, and how powerful is that direction? And we were able to do the meta-analysis for two different things, which was, what's the impact of monoculture versus these rotations on yield, and then the impact on nitrogen inputs. So basically all the research that was done at Swift Current and all this research that was done within Alberta and across the prairies on those rotations over 30 or 40 years, we were able to leverage all the data and take a look at this question. And then we translated that impact of yield and nitrogen input on greenhouse gas impacts. So this work, but you'll hear meta-analysis being used in the health and nutrition or health sector all the time. But there's actually an opportunity to use it within agriculture. We were trying to make a statement on, okay, well, individual studies only tell you so much. What does is there a method to actually just say definitively, okay, all of the studies are saying this in a statistically significant way? So it's a neat study, actually. It was cool to kind of do, and because there's not a lot of agricultural meta-analysis that have been done. So there you go.
I think that probably reiterates the need for on-farm capturing on-farm data and information, meaning to say you can eventually definitively say that these reductions are occurring based on your baseline previously.
Yeah, I think like we did, as part of that study, we did a scenario analysis on, well, now that we have this statistical story to say about all of these studies, we're able to we actually applied that nationally. Well, what does this mean about the entire pea crop, or the pea and lentil crop that's rotated with wheat in Canada? And we were able to say, okay, well, it's a megaton of carbon reductions based on that rotation, including including that crop in rotation. Based on what we see with the rotation across Canada, it was a megaton. So anyways, take a look at the study. It's out there.
Okay.
So there you go.
So I see we're at 11:03. While I'm just closing out, I might, and there's no more questions coming in, I might ask you to go to your last slide so people can see your contact information. If there wasn't any questions that weren't answered, they can touch base with you or myself, of course. This is your content though, and you do know it the best. I will mention that there is actually 3 upcoming sustainability webinars booked. So October 17th, we have the Sustainable Forest Management in Alberta presentation. On November 26th, we have Alberta chicken producers. And December 10th, we have the Field to Market Canada initiative that you mentioned a number of times. So if people want to hear more about what exactly that announcement's going to be and how what it means, definitely tune into the December 10th presentation with Marcus Weber. So I thank you so much for your time today. You are so very busy, and I know time is valuable. So thanks for your time, Dennis, and have a good day, everyone.
All right. Thanks a lot, Carrie Ann.
Take care. Bye-bye.